Hello and welcome to Talks at Pulitzer. Thank you for joining us. I'm Steve Sapienza with the Pulitzer Center. This is our second web talk related to a truly amazing data journalism, investigative journalism, and social research journalism project published by High Country News called Land Grab Universities. If you've not read it or seen this groundbreaking project, I urge you to check it out. You can go check it out at landgrabu.org. In the first web talk, it was really kind of an overview of this multifaceted investigation and a discussion about how it came about and the direction of the story and if you want to check that out, you can find it on our YouTube channel if you missed that. This second talk is intended to give university students, professors, as well as journalists information they need to access the LandGrabU data and hopefully inspire people to do their own reporting and investigations on the subject of land grabs that benefited U.S. schools of higher education. In a moment, I'll introduce you to the part of the team that researched and investigated these land grabs. And we'll have a chat with them and they'll tell you how you can make use of the research and the data. So I want to thank you again for joining. We are using the hashtag today, hashtag LandGrabU during the talk. So please use that if you're tweeting. Let's see, we are waiting right now for people to join us in the chat. Maybe you could tell us where you're listening or watching from. We'd love to know where people are joining us from. Take a minute here while we wait. Washington, D.C., close to where I'm based. Princeton, New Jersey. Tahoe City, Boston, Mass. Kingston, Rhode Island. Boy, they're just flying in here. This is great. Portland, Oregon. Tampa, Florida. Fantastic. Thank you for joining us. Philadelphia, Chicago, Peru. Terrific. Thank you all for joining us. Look like, did I see Nairobi go by? Wow, terrific. Ankara, Laramie, Wyoming. Fantastic. Thank you all for joining us today. Over the past 3 years, journalists and newsrooms around the world have been submitting requests to the Pulitzer Center and getting support to report on a host of land and property rights issues, many of them involving land rights of indigenous peoples. And I encourage you to go to our website and explore the many terrific reporting projects we have related to that. Today is an opportunity for us to discuss one of those projects that was supported with those funds. But first, I'm just going to give you a little background on the Pulitzer Center if you're unfamiliar. The Pulitzer Center started in 2006 by supporting just 9 projects. Last year, we approved more than 180 projects from professional journalists. We had 43 reporting fellows from our campus consortium partner schools, and they completed projects in 29 different countries. Many of the journalists we support are covering indigenous issues around the globe. We are also making an effort to support journalists and newsrooms who are covering the current pandemic, and we have a major rainforest journalism initiative that is supporting journalists to report on tropical rainforests in the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and in Southeast Asia. On the education front, we reach thousands of students and educators each year via our class visits, online sessions, teacher professional development workshops, and university events with our journalist grantees and education staff. And then, of course, there are public events like the one today, this web talk. We really appreciate all the support, and for people joining us today, remember that we are a nonprofit journalism org, so we depend on donor support as well. Today's talk will focus on a project that explores how the seizure of millions of acres of indigenous land in the US became the foundation of the land-grant university system in the United States. To help us grasp the magnitude of this wealth transfer and to share their experience and their story for how they came together to produce this groundbreaking project for High Country News. We're joined by Tristan Ahtone, historian Dr. Bobby Lee, and journalist and data designer Geoff McGhee. They're all part of a very impressive team that worked on this project It also includes another programmer, a cartographer, a photographer, and many of the staff at High Country News. I should mention that the Fund for Investigative Journalism and the Pulitzer Center both supported this project. So together, this team, this hybrid team of journalists and historians, they tracked the parcels of land that were taken from Native American tribes and traced the ownership and financial flows to some of America's flagship land-grant universities. I'm going to introduce the team here that we have with us today. Tristan Ahtone has served as Associate Editor for Indigenous Affairs at High Country News. He has reported for the PBS NewsHour, Frontline, National Native News, NPR, and Al Jazeera America. Ahtone's stories have won multiple honors, including investigative awards from Public Radio and News Directors Incorporated and the Gannett Foundation. He's a citizen of the Kiowa tribe, and he was awarded a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard in 2017. He also serves as a board member for the Native American Journalists Association, and he's currently editor-in-chief of the Texas Observer. Thanks for joining us, Tristan. Dr. Lee is a lecturer in American history at the University of Cambridge, a fellow of Solwayne College, and junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. He earned his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, a land-grant university. Geoff McGhee specializes in interactive data visualization and multimedia storytelling. He's a veteran of multimedia and infographics, worked at the New York Times, contributed to Le Monde and ABC News. McGhee spent a Knight Fellowship year at Stanford in 2009-2010, researching data visualization, and that resulted in a widely cited video documentary, Journalism in the Age of Data. At Stanford University's Bill Lane Center for the American West, McGhee is responsible for the center's website and digital publications. Welcome, Geoff. Before we move on, just a few housekeeping matters. We'll first hear from Tristan and Dr. Lee with a little overview of the project and bring people up to speed with what's been going on with that. Then we will turn the conversation over to Geoff McGhee, who's going to talk about news apps and how this news app is different from other news apps out there. Then we'll do a deep dive into the data, and that will be led by Tristan and Dr. Lee, providing tips and how to get to the data and finding stories in the data. And then we'll turn to audience Q&A. So there's a Q&A icon on your screen, and you can begin adding your questions there throughout our conversation. So feel free to go ahead and do that. There's also a chat icon on your screen, and we'd appreciate it if you use the chat box for any specific tech issues you experience. You should note that all attendees are muted, but if you can't hear myself or the guests, please let us know through that chat box, and we can see if we can help you out. Remember, any specific questions you may have, they should go in the Q&A for us. We want to let you know that we are recording this session today, and we will post it online for those who aren't with us. One final housekeeping matter before we start. Please remember to stay online once this session ends to participate in a brief survey to help us better serve your interests. So let's start out here. You know, we're going to assume, and this is our second web talk related to this amazing project. So we're going to assume that most people watching have some familiarity of the project. But Tristan, perhaps you could give us just a really brief overview, and you know, tell us when it was published, how long you were working on it, who was involved, and just to give people a sense of it.
Yeah, and thanks again for the invitation to be here. Essentially, we've been working on this story for about 2 years. And at the heart of the story is we were looking at where land-grant universities got their land, and most importantly, from who they got their land from. As part of the sort of myth around land-grant universities, and as well as the United States in general, is there's this sense that that land in the United States, or what is currently the United States, was unoccupied, being unused, and could be used for anything that the U.S. needed it for. Obviously, that is not the case. We know that indigenous people were here and are still here. And what we were able to do was look at the exact parcels of land that were given to land-grant universities and figure out who they belonged to. So that was approximately 11 million acres that we reconstructed. We were able to tie them to almost 250 different indigenous communities and tribes, and looked at the legal tools that were used to dispossess those communities of their land, which were approximately 160 violence-backed land cessions.
And this investigation was published, I guess, a little over a month ago. And what has been the reaction to the investigation so far, Tristan? What have you been hearing?
I think one of the common threads that we hear a lot is individuals who had no clue of this history. Often we joke about how we're, especially when reporting in Indian country, is that we're doing the work that your public school likely failed to do. And this has been a really big example of how many people have been shocked, like absolutely shocked by the history here. Apart from initial shock, I think what we've really been able to see starting to happen are students, professors, folks associated with universities start to look very critically at the data and start having some really interesting conversations about what this data can be used for, what it means for their institutions, what it means for their students. For instance, we're hearing that some students are looking at using the data to advocate for free tuition for indigenous students. We're hearing conversations about using income generated from from the endowments that are connected to the original land grants to use those to buy back land for tribes. We've seen a really wide variety of really interesting conversations that are happening here. And I think we're going to continue to see those grow and hopefully start seeing a lot more coverage of what those conversations are looking like, since it seems that there are some pretty major shifts in thinking when it comes to looking at land-grant universities and their responsibilities today with this data in mind.
Absolutely, and a lot more that can be done with all this terrific data that you all generated from this project, and it's just the start, really, hopefully. Dr. Lee, Tristan mentioned that the reconstruction of all these land transfers. Can you give our audience some sense of where you found the documents and the clues and evidence that undergirded this whole investigation?
Yeah, maybe I should back up a second and say something about the Moral Act, what that is, because
yes,
that's really at the center of the sort of the document search that we went on. The sort of national land grant system that we're familiar with today. Land grant universities had existed before the Civil War when the Moral Act was passed in 1862, but what the Moral Act did was it created a national system of land grant universities. It appropriated land from the public domain, which had been land that had been expropriated from indigenous nations over the course of the previous years, previous decades, and it redistributed that land to states to sell off to raise endowments for a university or universities of their choice. So the challenge in pursuing this project to turn it from a sort of general idea, I mean, there's it's easy to realize that the land that universities benefited from came from indigenous sources. We know that all the land within what is today the United States originally were indigenous homelands. The question was whose, when, and how did they go through this redistributive process? And that required going beyond the sort of the general outlook of what the act said it was going to do to following the story of what it actually did and how it did it. So the first thing that we had to do was figure out how much land we were talking about. You know, there was land that was it was pledged to the states, but we didn't know what was actually distributed. So we had to figure out a series of benchmarks to figure out what were the physical acres that were actually distributed through the Morrill Act or subsequent sort of in lieu acts is the sort of technical term for it. We had to figure out how many acres we were talking about to create benchmarks, sort of like buckets that we were looking to fill with the data that we were going to search for. So we canvassed federal reports from universities to figure out what we were going to expect to find. And what we expected to find was about 10.8 million acres of land, which is an area a little bit larger than the size of Massachusetts and Connecticut combined, or if you're in Europe, about the size of Denmark. And then we had to figure out where this land was. So look at the process of parceling it out to universities, to states, for universities to sell, and that was a matter of looking for the lists. Basically, lots of lists that were describing the parcels of land, and lots of patents that were used to issue, the deeds that were used to issue the land. So there were a number of sources that we used to find this information. Various archival and online sources. The main one was the Bureau of Land Management's land patent database, which tags many of the Morrill Act parcels, but not all of them. So after finding what we could through digital methods, we went to the National Archives, we went to state and university archives, and we filled in the gaps, finding all of the geographic descriptions of the parcels of the Morrill Act lands. Once we had the Morrill Act lands, a sort of Denmark area sized area broken up into about 80,000 parcels, once we had those identified and we could locate them on the ground, then we were in the position to be able to ask for the first time, where did this land come from? Who did it come from? How did it come into the United States' hands to be able to redistribute it to these states? And at that point, what we did was a relatively simple form of analysis in GIS, a spatial join. We took indigenous land cessions, areas that had been either seized or had been taken through ratified or unratified treaties. And we just overlaid one layer on the other, where the parcels were, where the land cessions were. And then we could make these two data sets speak to each other for the first time and sort of thread the connection from indigenous homelands through the grants to the universities. And what you see on the landgrabu.org website is a sort of visualization of that reconnection when you look at the maps there. So it was a matter of locating this material archivally, locating it online, and putting it together into a geodatabase that could answer what is a relatively simple question to ask, but a difficult one to assemble all the details.
Just a massive amount of work. You mentioned filling in the gaps. What were some examples of gaps that you had to fill in, and what were where did you find that information? What shape, is it in?
So we got most of our information from the Bureau of Land Management's website, and once we had incorporated all of that, we could compare what we had found to our benchmarks, and we could figure out where the gaps were. We could find that whole states were missing. We could find that parts of states were missing. So what we did was we looked for, at the Minnesota Historical Society, we found the land agent reports where they were sending their lists of parcel selections in, and that's how we filled in Minnesota. The New Mexico data wasn't in Washington. But we were able to find it in the BLM's state archive in New Mexico. For some states, in the Dakotas and in Missouri, we found lists of the land that was for sale, and we were able to incorporate sort of multiple sources and compare the locations and, remove the duplicates so we could figure out how much of our benchmarks for each state we were finding. And in the end, sort of using these these mixed methods, we were able to compile a data set that represents in excess of 99% of the Morrill Act lands, is what we estimate.
Terrific. And so you've got the data set, and Tristan, at what point do you start reporting?
Well, at the last minute, like all good reporters, obviously. Essentially when we started having a really clear sense of just sort of scope, it was easy to start looking for story and looking for like narrative to tie to it. So one of the things that we did very early on, you'll see in the story, there's a large section of Minnesota. In the writing process, originally that was more at the top, sort of in the lead, because as Bobby and I were looking at the actual data and looking at dates, times, all that kind of thing, we knew, for instance, that when Minnesota was granted their land, that it was only like 5 weeks after the mass hanging at Mankato, where the 38 Dakota men were hung in the largest mass hanging in U.S. history. So because we sort of, especially because a lot of my work deals with reporting in indigenous communities and having to know a lot of that history so that you can do accurate reporting, like having that information and knowing that you could marry those two things became very apparent very, very quickly. So like sort of knowing communities, knowing dates, knowing places is immensely helpful in terms of being able to marry narrative with it. So, essentially, again, as soon as we had like a really broad sense of what was sort of happening on a timeline and geographically, it was easy to sort of zoom in and take a look at particular areas to see what was happening at the time, who was involved, and why did these patterns look like they did.
Great. So it was published by High Country News. There's a long investigative piece in their magazine. It exists online, and then part of the project involved developing a news app, and that's where Geoff McGhee comes in. And Geoff, I'd like to turn over this portion to you to talk to our audience about this particular news app, how it's different from other news apps, and why it was designed the way it was for this particular investigation in this story.
Great. Yeah. Well, I'm so pleased to be here, and this has been such a tremendous opportunity to be a part of this project. I am no longer full time at the Bill Lane Center at Stanford, where I was for 9 years, and it's interesting because this is sort of the epitome of the type of project that I was hired to do, was to look for ways to fuse academic scholarship and inquiry with compelling journalism. And this is, to me, like one of the best projects that the Bill Lane Center never did in that regard. I think there's many more opportunities for this kind of reporting, and we are constantly reminded that the events of the past are echoed today. There's a tremendous upswing in interest in the 1918 flu pandemic, I needless to say right now, and we're really benefiting from all the scholarship and what is understood about that. The fact that we're now seeing, just without digressing too much, we're now seeing the infection curves of major US cities from 1919, 1918, 1920. And it's extraordinary the amount of work of digitizing that data and making it available today. And it's a really beautiful thing when you can see that happen. So yeah, I've got a few slides to show, and I thought that this would be an opportunity for people to get a look at not just the app, but also the story. So let me just launch right into it then. So this is a look at the print spread in High Country News, which is has always been a very, very visual and lovely magazine, and just redesigned this past winter to be even more so. It's a great subscription deal too, $40 a year gets you, I think 12 issues this year it's gonna be. So this is the opening spread here with the photographs by Kayla Goodluck. Interestingly, the caption not only tells you where this is, but gives you the parcel ID number. So already we're embedding some data in this image. It's a multi-page spread. I'm not sure how many two facing pages there are in it. Tristan probably could tell us, at least 8 to 10. Original photography from all over the American West and the Great Plains that Kaylin did. Beautiful explanatory maps by Margaret Pierce, geographer and scholar, and infographics as well. Fascinating narrative story, process diagrams showing how the parcels were allocated and how universities benefited from them. Summary graphics showing, for example, here we're seeing on the left, we're seeing which universities benefited the most in terms of acreage. You'll see Cornell is very prominent there in that bar graph in the lower left. And also even more so in terms of how much money they were able to raise off of these lands. Cornell just really lapped the crowd. And of course, that's a long tail there. There's many more universities in this list, but really a lot happening here, and no exception online. Here is the page for that particular issue and the feature story as it appeared online. And I was using an incognito browser. I am a subscriber, just in case anyone's wondering. So here's a look at the feature story. Again, the graphics, you can blow them up. You can get a nice sharp, that's all the parcels, of course, in the explainer there. Kaylin's photography again. It's just a real, this is a stupendous piece of work. And so it begs the question, like, what could possibly be missing? This is pretty much soup to nuts, right? And I could end it here, but I won't. So I was first in touch with, through Margaret Pierce, the cartographer, back in October. It led to a series of conversations about how HCN and Professor Lee could get this data into more people's hands, and to view this as beyond a very rich feature story, to view it as more of a possibility of inquiry on a larger scale into this topic. What we have, what's missing, if you will, is material for what could be many, many more stories, and tremendous data set. There was 160 different treaties or land transfers, including outright seizures, through which this land became available for redistribution. There are 52 universities that benefited from it. Just about 250 individual native nations whose land was acquired, and a good 80-something thousand, 79,300, I think, land parcels in 24 states, totaling almost 11 million acres. So, if you live west of the Mississippi, there's a good chance you're probably not far from one of these parcels, or in Florida for that matter. And $23 million in contemporary, that is historic value, that when you adjust it for inflation is nearly $500 million. So there's a lot of richness here that goes beyond even the longest, even if it was a 100-page story. What do you do with it? One of the things that this story does really well, and this is before my involvement even begins, is summarizing it very effectively and powerfully in information graphics and maps. The database was already put together by Bobby and Tristan and the researchers who contributed to it. And so those, in fact, are not super high tech. They're comma separated spreadsheets and geodatabases that you link them together and boom, off you go. And in fact, within a couple days of publication, at least one of the readers downloaded the data, reconstructed the database, did some analysis, and then wrote in a very thoughtful. I should mention that's the guy who hired me at the Bill Lane Center. That's John Christensen, who's now at UCLA. So then you can take it and you can post it on GitHub, or some venue where people can just download it and work with it. And then that's a great start. But for the non-technical user who doesn't know how to download a bunch of CSVs and join them with shapefiles, there's a possibility of presenting it online in a news application, which then begs the question, or poses the question, better said, what is a news application? So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but basically a news app, you've encountered them probably if you've been on a site, especially like ProPublica. This is a companion to a collaboration they did with the Charleston Gazette and Mail, looking at the practices of natural gas fracking companies in West Virginia. This one, I wish I captured a video of it because it's really extraordinary. You can look down on every single fracking well in West Virginia. This is looking at death row inmates in Texas with the Texas Tribune. This is looking at ProPublica, looking at doctors who have possibly abused Medicare funding, or in this case, no, this is dollars for docs. This is getting goodies from pharmaceuticals in exchange for pharmaceutical companies. And then more recently, we see these coronavirus trackers, for example, that a lot of publications are doing. Los Angeles Times is really one of the granddaddies of news apps. They've, since 2007, I think they've had a LA homicides database that tracks every single person who's been killed in Los Angeles, and has a page for each person, and also the capacity for people to either write tributes or recollections or add the information that they know about that person. It's really extraordinary effort. So these are news applications. How would you define what they are? I thought, maybe we should see if there's an official definition. I don't know if I'd go that far, but one way in the Data Journalism Handbook, which was sort of crowdsourced by a bunch of digital journalists, came up with one description I think is pretty good. They're windows into the data behind a story. They might be searchable databases or sleek visualizations or something else altogether. Maybe what we have is some combination of that. News apps encourage readers to interact with data in a context that's meaningful to them, looking up trends in their area, checking up their local doctor, searching political contributions. And so here is the entrance, the front page of the Land Grab University's news app, which for numerous reasons, we published on a separate server. High Country News's content management system can only take so much non-standard content. And so we realized pretty early on that we were going to have to create something separately. And of course, when you have two websites, a person can only really look at one at a time. So that creates a bit of a two-body problem that we had to address, which meant putting some of the data in the story, as we saw, but also putting some of the story in the data, because we don't want this to be, I mean, it's never going to be completely uninteresting because the subject matter is so important and so interesting, but we didn't want to end up creating a TurboTax either. So what can you do with a news app? You can explore the entirety of a data set, or at least the data that's available digitally. You can see different dimensions of that data. If you think about like that dollars for docs thing, like you might look at individual doctors, you might look at the states they're in, you might look at the drugs that they're prescribing or the drug companies, different angles that you might enter through. You can get summary views, so you might get an overview, like a visual overview, a map, or just summary statistics. You can filter and sort the data, and ideally, you can see record level detail. You can drill down to a specific phenomenon as part of this larger set, And, again, you can recenter this story around your focus of particular interest. Maybe you're interested in land transfers that happen in what is now Minnesota. So let's see how the application affords that kind of approach. So here we are, this is the main page, and I'm scrolling through an introductory piece that talks about the Moral Act and gives you some basic stats, just recapitulating somewhat what's already in the story. But here now, this first thing that we're going to encounter is this map visualization showing the linkages between, say, in this case, Cornell University and the lands. I've now zoomed in on upper Wisconsin, and we see the extraordinary number of parcels with these arcs leading back to Ithaca, New York, and to Cornell, as this value is basically being extracted from these lands and turned over to Cornell. And here we'll switch to South Carolina, Clemson, and there's a historically Black school there also, South Carolina. And so you can see, you can move in 3D space and see the spatial relationships between the universities and the lands they got. Generally a west to east direction, although here, when you look at Colorado, Western states received land within their own state boundaries. Now, why did Cornell get so much? It was allocated on the basis of how large a congressional delegation was for a state, and New York was, as now, but especially then, was far and away the most populous state in the country. So here's Minnesota. Now I'm going to open up the fire hose. This is all of the US. This is more than 90,000 arcs connecting universities with land parcels, and is almost too much to absorb. Probably the takeaway message here is it's a lot, but ideally through filtering and judicious exploration, you can get much more signal than just noise. So
Geoff,
there's, yeah.
what sort of
ahead,
tools? Steve. What sort of tools are you using to design?
Yeah, so this is built in just plain HTML and JavaScript using some additional technologies like something called React. That's a framework that Facebook used to connect data with interaction. It's designed for sites that move a lot of data in and out of an interface quickly. The maps are using a service called Mapbox, which has a very powerful and very elegant and very fluid map presentation interface. And then we used, to show the arcs, we borrowed a technology created by Uber to track taxi rides from point A to point B. We leveraged their ability to generate large number of arcs from origin to destination so that we could then overlay that on the Mapbox map. And we were pushing the envelope a little bit in terms of the scale of data when we're getting to up to 90,000. How do you get 90,000 arcs out of 80,000 parcels? There were states that had multiple universities getting the same land. And so we wanted to be true to that.
Thank you.
And at the end of the talk, I'll just do a quick rundown of some of the technologies that are under the hood, but it's an important question if it looks baffling to how anyone could do this. You can see the different dimensions, right? So what are the dimensions in this story? That's a little bit different from, we changed the interface a little bit to reflect something a little bit different from the underlying data. The original data really looks at the treaties or seizures that brought land into the public domain for the United States, and didn't really mention individual native nations. Then you have the universities, of course, and you have the land parcels themselves. We refiltered the data so that we could extract the names of the co-signatories to these treaties or agreements, or even those affected by the seizures, so that we could have a more relatable entity. Because I think people are going to be curious about like what native nations were most affected by this. But anyway, so let's look at these three dimensions on the main page. So now we're going to resume where we were. The first section looks at the universities and gives you an overview, say Cornell and Ezra Cornell and his role in making great profit on this. So, and then here there's a list of the 10 universities with the greatest gains. Then we go through native nations and we show the nations that lost the most, like Chippewa, giving up 2.2 million acres to this, and then the lands themselves. And so there's a little preamble that introduces you to this. But basically, so we're showing, in this case, these are our three main dimensions: universities, native nations, and the land parcels themselves. And then that, what I mentioned before, record level detail. So there, so far we've looked at mostly summary information, although we've had some totals, like for Cornell University, the amount of land that it got. But let's see what record level detail looks like. So here now we're back in where we left off. Now I'm going to search for King County. I'm talking to you now in Seattle, Washington. And here now I filtered the list down to all the parcels in King County. And now I can zoom in to the Pacific Northwest. And here is the parcel that I clicked on. That was allocated to Washington State University. And it's just a little bit northwest of Mount Rainier. It was ceded by the Duwamish and Squamish in 1855. Then I can also move around in this view and look at other parcels. And here, this pause is where I'm clicking the locate me. So this is where I am right now. I am in New York State. No, I'm in a section in a parcel that was given to Cornell. And you know what, I forgot to click on it. So we're actually seeing the data for the previous parcel here. But as you zoom out, you can see that there's quite a number of land parcels given to universities here. We've turned off the arcs to make it a little easier to get around. And you can click on any of these and get data. And actually, I'm going to pause the video right there because I just want to show you something. That little pop-up window that came up, you can click on Duwamish, Squamish, you can click on Alabama, Delaware, Georgia. These are all like cross-tabulated. So I can use that as an entry point to go look at, oh, I want to know what schools in Louisiana got land, or I want to know what Native nations gave up land. So again, here's the record level detail. Now I can pivot to looking at Washington State University. And I get basic information like what is the size of their current endowment, of which this original gift is really a very key part. It's the seed money around which much of this endowment grew. We can also see things like that it's a public university. It opened in 1892. And then it has nearly 32,000 students, and less than 200 of them identify as American Indian or Alaskan Native. In the Pacific Northwest, in an area where there's a very considerable and visible indigenous population. Scroll down a little further and we can see what their gains were from the Morrill Act, 90,000 acres, adjusted for inflation, $32 million. And then here is a look at, again, this is the summary data here. This is a look at the footprint of Washington State University land. And here are the tribes that contributed the most. So you can see Okanagan and Methau have both given about $10 million. You might find that suspicious that they're at the same amount. That's because we can't actually disambiguate those lands. These two tribes ceded land at the same time. And so you're gonna have some double counting here, but we think it's worth it to be able to identify those individuals. So I click on Okanagan, and now I'm gonna see the record for Okanagan, and it shows the footprint of lands that they ceded in universities they went to. In this case, all Okanagan lands went to Washington State University. In other cases, you might see a footprint that extends across the US. 3 land cessions, that's the treaties that they're involved in, supplied 27,500 acres. And here are the 3 treaties that they're involved in. And then here are the universities that, so you can pivot from one, here now you can pivot to lands. You could look at the individual parcels again and see how much each parcel was worth to the university. And then because we have had to divorce ourselves from this incredibly rich and fascinating narrative story, the feature story on High Country News, we can't assume that someone who is looking at the app has had the chance to read that story. So we provide a narrative layer that gives you a basic introduction to the story. In this case, it's this sort of little scrolly telling slideshow here, 11 million acres, 52 universities, the 162 treaties, 11 million acres of indigenous lands, here they are. And then these universities were not built just on the land, but with the land. And this site reconstructs the ties. And then these introductory parts here, we're looking at, basic information about the Morrill Act. So if you've just joined us, in a sense, to use a TV term, we're adding that extra layer of narrative. And I wouldn't say that that's something we invented specifically for this app. It is not uncommon, but a lot of news apps do tend to be more like just the data and assume a certain amount of conversancy with the story from other places. But we felt that for something to have lasting value as the feature story becomes less visible, that this needs to be more self-sustaining. So yeah, some story aspects had to be reiterated. So this is really pretty much my last slide, and I'm taking you through just a screencast of me going through this on a smaller screen. It is somewhat mobile friendly, and I can use it on a phone. It's a lot of data to push through though. This is what we call a static site, meaning that it's not a database where there's an application that's like processing data and then returning result, but rather it's all been generated into static files that sit on a server, and that has security implications. It means that there's really nothing to hack. There's no database to get into. There's no user privileges to take seizure of. And it also means there's less maintenance in the long term, because as a news organization, you don't want to build a machine you have to keep putting spare parts into and oil and stuff like that. As a journalist, I like to think of my work as a document, not a machine. And that's one of the downsides of a lot of web technology is everything's a damn machine. So Gatsby is this technology that basically takes a site that you sort of generate on your local computer, and then you can push it to a server, JavaScript, so pretty much straight browser technology, plus this thing called React that lets you connect interactions with data calls. That is like a query or something, and then Node.js is like a JavaScript-based server that's sitting on an Amazon Web Services host. So basically, we create our own custom server that we then rent from Amazon. But it's based on an amount of data you transfer billing basis, and so if traffic goes down to a smaller long tail kind of thing over time, the incremental costs for High Country News should be fairly low. And we just started, it was a sprint. The print publication date was set for the beginning of April, and we knew that we had to get it going. So we started designing it in January, and then built it in February, March, and here we are. And I have to take my invisible hat off to Cody Leff, who unfortunately can't join us today, but did I really think, a phenomenal job taking this vision and making a reality of it. It was not an easy project at all. We had very high ambitions. But we're glad to have it out there. So
Yeah.
So thanks to High Country News, Tristan Kalen, the photographer, Gretchen, the web editor, Brian Calvert, the editor-in-chief, and Bobby and Margaret and Eric Steiner, a former colleague of mine at Stanford, helped with this very much. He does a lot of visualization work. And to the Pulitzer Center and the Fund for Investigative Journalism. So thanks.
Well, thank you for that really, really great, informative overview and presentation. That was excellent. It's such an impressive work that you, Cody, and the team have done. It's innovative. It's detailed. It's the functionality of it, and there's just a ton of information there, well thought out, and the ability for people to further explore, which I just really love about this project. So you're all to be congratulated. Fantastic. I'd like to move on to the next portion of this web talk, and that would be speaking with Dr. Lee and Tristan about how newsrooms, students, professors might use the data collected to do their own research, further their own interest in looking into this topic. And I know from the outset, Tristan and the team sort of envisioned this as a living project that you know, other newsrooms could pick up this data, work with it, look for stories in their own regions or with their own schools. So you know, I'd like to hear more about that, and maybe some tips from you both of how people could go about accessing the data and using it for their own investigation. So I'll turn it over to you both.
I mean, in short, and I'll let Bobby talk in more detail about how it can be used or downloaded. I mean, we have everything in raw form on GitHub, so you can download it there, or obviously use the app that was built if you're not feeling as confident as using you know, the tabular data, like me. So you know, the app really works really well to kind of visualize it and see what's going on at a very granular level. I think, though, when we're talking about what newsrooms can do, you know, our follow-up story that's going to be coming out soon is going to be looking at universities that still have still benefit from these lands that have yet to be sold. So that's both surface acres as well as even mineral acres. And we'll be putting that data out as well for people to look at. If reporters are interested, they can get a hold of us, and happy to share some of the stuff that we have already. But we'll put everything out when that story comes out, and happy to collaborate early on. I think more generally, though, when looking at what reporters can do, I think it's asking some questions about what role and what responsibilities universities have, especially in light of this data. I mean, I think that like when we're thinking about even international law and ethics, I mean, there is a very firm grounding in the idea that victims of crimes against humanity are entitled to some form of redress. You know, the idea of reparative justice is one that exists around the world. We've already started seeing some universities look at this in terms of looking at their relationships with the slave trade. And it's not exactly a one-to-one comparison here, but we're still talking about universities that are benefiting from crimes against humanity. The treatment, the killing, and the removal of indigenous people by the United States meets every requirement of being a crime and being an act of genocide by international standards. So you have an act that is the act of genocide that is happening, and you have institutions that are actively benefiting from that. So when we start to think about this and these foundations, I think it raises a lot of questions about what role universities have, how and what conversations they should be having, and what responsibilities they have to the tribal nations that were impacted by their development, as well as their own indigenous students. Again, we've seen a really wide variety of conversations, things that like we were not expecting in terms of even like land buyback programs and whatnot. I think that when we see that those conversations are happening, it leaves a large, like a really wide door for looking at this issue in creative ways and thinking about what justice actually means. And I do think that as reporters, we should be looking at how we are exposing human rights violations, be them current or even in the recent past, because technically this isn't actually all that long ago, and that money is still on the books, and those universities a lot of universities are still benefiting from those lands and pulling in money. So this isn't ancient history. This is ongoing impact.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, the question from the beginning was, how do we arrange this project to empower readers, students, laymen who are coming across the story to pursue those types of follow-up projects, right? What we knew at the beginning, what we didn't know was how all the details were going to look, but we knew that the story, the scope of the story was going to be enormous. And what it turned out, 11 million acres, over 50 universities, 250 indigenous nations. It's an enormously complicated project. We couldn't hope to tell all of that in a single story. We couldn't hope to tell that in a book. We couldn't hope to tell that in multiple books. When you think about some of these connections between the universities, like Penn State, 70 different indigenous land sessions that are connected to even more nations, because many of these sessions are signed by multiple nations. It's enormously complicated. So what we wound up pursuing was sort of a multi-scaled academic journalism collaboration, right? And at sort of the most curated level, you have the story, the print story that came out, our sort of vision of what we see in the data of how this program works, a sort of, an overview from 30,000 feet in the air. And then the next sort of level down in curation is the landgrabu.org website, which lets people look for stories that they're interested in the data, to go places that we weren't able to go in the story that we publish. And then the final sort of level of granularity that we have is the downloadable data set, where you can pull this data for yourself. You can map it for yourself and analyze it in GIS, but I'd also like to emphasize that you can work with this data just using a program like Excel. We have sort of, in the arrangement of the downloadable data, we have sort of baked in the core GIS analysis that enables you to connect universities to indigenous nations and indigenous land sessions. And that is embedded in the data that can be downloaded from the site. I have a few slides here where I can show sort of like nuts and bolts. How do you go from having an idea for wanting to pursue a follow-up on this story, to do additional research, to show it with your students, or work with it with your students, to sort of where do you go and what do you do? How do you get a hold of that stuff? Let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay, I think it's sharing now. Okay, can I get a thumbs up if you see the GitHub page? All right.
Yes, we're good.
So if you go into the landgrabu.org site, or there's also links from the story, you can find your way to the downloadable data set here. There is basically there's the user guide, and there's a folder full of data. You can pull all this stuff on your own machine. Let me see. If you pull the user guide here, basically the user guide gives a brief overview of the project, but more importantly, it gives descriptions in layman's terms of all of the fields of data that you're going to find in the downloadable data set, so you can figure out, you know, exactly what it is you're looking at. It's sort of like a handy dictionary to the data here. It has a short sort of description on the sort of the use of the database. The database is, as Geoff mentioned earlier, it's a series of CSV files and shape files. If you are interested in mapping the data yourself, it's just a simple join, where you join the CSV files to the shape files. If you're not interested in mapping the data, you can work with the CSV files without working with the polygon data. And there's a link in here. If you've never, it's quite a simple maneuver in GIS to join the data. There's a link here to a video tutorial on how to do it. I mean, if you were with a first semester GIS class, this would be one of the earliest things that you would learn. So it's not sort of deep down into the weeds of GIS. And if you go a little bit further in the guide here, you'll see, you know, these are all of the field titles, and it just gives a description of what the data is that you're seeing. But when you open up the material, the sort of I'm just going to look at the CSV files here, because I think that's what is most easily accessible to most folks, and it enables you to generate summary statistics to say, you know, Cornell University got so many acres from one nation, so many acres from another nation, how much was paid, if anything, for those acres, what was raised from those acres, just sort of the sort of bare bones statistics of the connections that this database pulls out and that you see us working with in the story itself. The largest of these files it's basically a spreadsheet of the 80,000 or so parcels with the sort of data running across it. The amount of acres in the parcel you see here, Royce numbers, those are indigenous session numbers connected to maps, the names of the signatories, if there were any, dates, there's all of the information that's described in the guide. There's also, and these correspond in some ways to the levels of data that you were seeing on the site, right? There's the sort of land connects to the parcels, right? This other indigenous land sessions CSV lists the 162 land sessions that we identified that connects to those parcels. And then we have a universities CSV that lists the 52 different universities and basic information about all of them. There's additional information in the CSVs that isn't online. Additional material on dates. Oh, I'm sorry. They're doing the clapping for the NHS. If you hear the noise in the background, it's 8 o'clock on Thursdays. You know where I am.
Don't gloat about your national health insurance system, Bobby.
Well, I wasn't able to get tested when I was sick, so that's all. That's all I'll say. But I'll just say here. So there's additional information in here. A short sort of what you're seeing here is a capsule biography of what we know about how this the land was sold to raise funds for the university. You know, a couple of sentences, and you can just you can compare to the user guide and look and read along. It's all pretty intuitive if you just spend a half hour or so looking through it. It's all sort of in plain English. And then probably the most valuable for reporters or people who are looking for quick summary data is an Excel spreadsheet that we included with the downloadable data that has sort of several tabs here that contain what we expected would be frequent queries of the data that people might want to do. So on this first one, university summaries, you have the names of all the universities, where they're located, the amount of acres that we were expected, the amount of acres that we found. You know, this is in New York. Cornell's grant, we found 99% of what we expected. The number of indigenous sessions that it overlays over, 63 separate sessions, the number of states that these parcels are located in, 15 states, and information on the financial data, on the endowments that they were able to raise from this land and the amount that was paid, if anything. So at the end here, you see the multiple, and you'll see these on the site. But if you just read this and as a sentence, it would say, for every dollar the United States spent to secure titles to the land that they granted to Cornell, Cornell was able to raise $139 for every dollar spent on indigenous titles. So you can see in sort of basic but stark terms what we're talking about when we're talking about wealth transfer happening through the Morrill Act. There's additional tabs here. This is one for states. So if you're interested in, for instance, how many, where were grants within the state of Arkansas? There were 8 different other states that got grant land within it that were representing 11 land grant universities. They received altogether 2,700 acres. The United States paid $2 for these 2,700 acres, and the universities raised $2,000 from these acres on average. There's also a tab here that connects the universities to the indigenous land sessions. So what you can see here is, here's the university, this is Auburn University, Alabama, and it lists each of the individual land sessions. We were able to identify the nations represented at those sessions, information on the date, the amount of acres within that session that Auburn benefited from, in this case, 800 acres of the Western Band Apache land that was acquired by the U.S. in 1886. And you can see the amount that was raised from that money, that was raised from that land, the amount paid. And this will have, you can order this either you can look by sessions, by ordering this fee, by this column by session number, or by state. And then you can see the number of sessions that they're connected to. The last table that we have in here relates back to the point that Geoff was describing about trying to separate out the names of nations from treaties when there were multiple signers of treaties, so we could be able to filter the data and see what was the cumulative the cumulative effect of the Morrill Act on the Apache here, for instance. And I should mention here that all the names of the nations here are as they appeared on the treaties or the legal documents, typically from the 19th century. Many of these names are not in use today. Many are considered racist and have been abandoned long ago. But one of the decisions that we made in organizing the data set was to use what we found on the documents and present what we found on the documents here in these columns, and that's what you see on the site. And there's the descriptions and the methodology of our reasoning there. But this table allows you to organize by name and to search by name or by university. And to see all the groups that are connected. These are like, if you think about the challenge of the project as trying to take apart a gigantic sort of knot, these are all the individual pieces that you can sort of line up evenly after you've sort of unspooled the knot. So these are summary data sets that are available also with the downloadable data. So what you could do here, if you were interested, say, in looking further at Alabama, at Auburn University, you could see how many sessions they were connected to, how much acres. You could see the breakdown of the funds that went into their principal through the Morrill Act. From each of these individual land sessions, and you could understand the sort of totality of the connections that made up their grant, that made up their endowment, and made it possible for them to sort of take off as a university. And that gives you the tools to then dig deeper into the history of this grant, to sort of where I started to sort of go where we weren't able to go. This has been designed so that that users can use this as a sort of springboard to look deeper. So imagine a class at Auburn University that has access to the university archives or the state archives. They could use our data as a jumping off point to figure out things that we weren't able to figure out in the process of researching this story. For instance, what did Auburn University do with the interest income that they derived from these funds? We don't know that, but now we're in a position to ask that with the backstory of knowing where this benefit actually came from.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you, Dr. Lee. It's really impressive to get a look under the hood and see all of that hard work represented there that you and the team did in collecting all that information. The organization of it and on GitHub is just fantastic. It's an amazing public resource. We talk about public service journalism. It's just magnificent that data set is out there, that people can work with it. And I guess we thank you and everyone for putting that together. I'd like to transition to the Q&A with the time that we have left. And I'm going to start with a question. And by the way, I want to thank everyone who submitted questions in advance of this web talk when you signed up. And we have a number of good questions here in the Q&A. So thank you very much. We'll try to get to as many as we can. But keeping a focus on the data process, the first question is from Iram, and wanted to know what were some of the challenges you faced during the data process of going through all of that information, and particularly this question is about what issues came up, that were tricky in dealing with this data.
A lot of tricky issues. One that we haven't talked about is generating the polygons to be able to map these. What you're looking at on the website is in like 97% of the cases accurate polygons that are accurate to the acre. So you could, put them in your GPS and drive to those parcels. This is how Kaylin was able to take photographs of those. The other 3% are accurate to the square mile. So you'd basically be in sort of spitting distance if you were able to put it in. But we had to generate these polygons, which took an enormous amount of time. The other problems were, the way that I described the process of collecting the data earlier is what it looked like from the other side of collecting the data. What we had to do was develop the methodology to be able to organize this data set. One of the Bureau of Land Management's data is tremendous on the one hand, but it's quite frustrating that it's not. It doesn't describe what it doesn't have.
Mm-hmm.
So figuring out what we were missing and being able to track those materials down, we had to collect some material at the very last minute because of the sort of the legal arrangement of the Morrill Act is more complicated than it appears on first blush. There's the passage of the Morrill Act, then there are these extending acts, then there's a process of grandfathering in states, and at the very end of this project, when we were in the midst of finishing the story, building the site, we were tracking down the final acres that we had missed because they were agricultural college acres that were brought into New Mexico through a separate act, but were considered part of, under the umbrella of the Morrill Act lands. So it was just trying to manage the complexity of pursuing a project that was trying to get an overview of a problem that we couldn't see initially. We couldn't see the sort of outline of it. It's like doing a puzzle without the box, right? And not knowing and not even knowing if all the pieces are in the box. And maybe they're in another box somewhere, and you have to find them and put the whole thing together. So yeah, pursuing this at the level of let's find every university, not let's do one, which would have been another easier pathway, but I think less effective in terms of demonstrating the scope of this issue.
Okay, thank you. This one, Geoff, I'm going to throw this to you. Someone just sort of asking, how do you start a data journalism project? Very broad question.
Oh yeah, and I think that would be that all three of us could tackle that one, but I think it varies. In investigative journalism, the idea is you want to find a body, which is to say you need to have evidence of harm, of real harm that could have been avoided, or where justice needs to be obtained, and that can be in the form of you rifling through a million traffic stops and finding that African Americans and people of color are wildly disproportionately pulled over, especially during daylight, because nobody can see inside the car at night. That would be an example where the data is going to drive the story and become your feedstock. In other cases, it may be more like, let's say there's a phenomenon of people suffering from addiction, to maybe an over-the-counter or a prescription drug that's being abused. And in that case, it's really going to be more driven by the phenomenon that is a problem, and you're trying to find evidence to both document the individual cases you're looking at, but also to zoom out and see what it is on a regional or national or global scale. So it really depends. Sometimes your smoking gun is the data, and sometimes it's something that happened that you want to document. So I would say in this case, it probably started with the data to some extent, because I don't know if I'm mischaracterizing it, but Bobby, your dissertation work was centered around very much making it possible to do mass analysis of land transfers in the US. Bobby's been basically creating a power tool to do that, whereas previously we only had tweezers, and that people were not doing large scale analysis of how land was how real estate was created in the US, through the Homestead Act and the Railroad Act and the Morrill Act and all the different ways that land was allocated to people. And Bobby has, by creating this data set, has made that possible. Because it used to be you had to go to the BLM website and look at one parcel at a time, one section. That's great if you want to look up Grandpa's farm or something like that, but you can't say how many grandmas, had homesteads and how many people of color and how old they were. Some of that is difficult enough to find out anyway, but anyway, so here I am, I'm telling someone else's story. So I will leave it at that.
Well, another question. This one is about, I think it may be from someone in Kenya. They say in Kenya, there is a land program on historical land injustices. Two of the recommendations are the land restitution and land restoration to the communities, that there should be that. Do you have legislation in the US that supports return of grabbed lands? And a second one to that, a follow-up maybe, is with regard to land governance debates, has anything been generated? What debates have been generated by this journalism related to land governance? And maybe Tristan, I don't know, Bobby.
Sure. I mean, I think in short, is there sort of any mechanism in the US to deal with land reparations? I mean, no. I think when we've, globally, there have been a number of different options that governments have taken to deal with, with this kind of history, like apologies, like truth and healing commissions or reconciliation commissions, or reparations in some form. None of those really exist here. I mean, the United States has not been particularly good at apologizing for much of anything, especially when it comes to its history with indigenous people and ongoing policy in Indian country. So in short, there is nothing there, but I do think that because of the nature of this work and the growing nature of reporters actually starting to look at the foundations of this country, everything from the 1619 project, even up to this and everything in between, it does start giving some clues as to where citizens could actually go. Bob and I wrote recently, even in the New York Times op-ed about this, that land grant universities actually provide a really great place to start thinking about those options, to be leaders in the areas of justice by actually sitting down and imagining what that can look like. I mean, that's on many levels what universities are for, is to incubate that kind of creative thinking and tackling of issues and problems. But in terms of then the question about what has this generated I believe that was a question at universities and those conversations. But again, I think we're still in early phases. We're getting kind of trickles in from professors, from students, etc. But at each, I think what's interesting is that at each university, this is looking a little bit different from what we can tell. And again, I think that's where the power of journalism can really come in, is that because there are so many varying different viewpoints on how to grapple with this history, it's a really unique sort of tableau of different stories that are out there. Again, everything from curriculum reform all the way to tuition assistance or funding of positions by indigenous faculty. The gamut is pretty wide. So we haven't seen a one-size-fits-all approach, and I think that's a pretty good thing, actually.
Yeah. What have you heard from states, if anything, state governments related to this project and the data?
Nothing. Not a word from state governments. I mean, I will say overwhelmingly the responses that we've gotten in places like social media have been overwhelmingly positive. People saying that they'd never heard about this before, or they had thought about it before, and they're happy to see it being detailed in such an explicit way that makes it more difficult to ignore. Yeah, the university responses have been mixed, of course, and this is a moment with the current pandemic where maybe there's a reluctance to think about anything else, that this is something that can be sort of kick the can down the road. And but we've spoken to some student groups. There's sort of there's a lot of unofficial talk that sounds promising of people thinking about possibly what could be done in relationship to this issue, or people wanting to write additional stories about it. But it's yet to be seen, what will come out of it in terms of actions.
Yeah, there's a lot that can be built on here. The story is still continuing. I'm getting questions from a couple K through 12 teachers asking about lesson plans. We didn't mean to exclude anybody, K through 12 teachers, in trying to focus this web talk at universities and newsrooms. Pulitzer Center, we have many different lesson plans for K through 12 educators, and yeah, we can follow up with you about that for sure. We've got one question from an educator who wants to know if they could get more training on how to use these this data and the tools, to teach it. I don't know what you all suggest. Maybe Geoff, you have some ideas there. I don't know.
Well, in terms of training, I think that would be more. There's two ways to look at that. One is, would you want to reproduce this database locally in a GIS where you can do queries but we were hoping that the application would make it possible for people to choose a couple of dimensions and be able to do a certain amount of analysis or first pass, calculate totals within the app. In terms of training, I noticed there was a question in the queue about data journalism training, and that is an area of great, there's a lot of activity there. The data journalism handbook is something that came out a number of years ago, but now there's a second edition coming out, and there's several more resources that have come online that I can send some links out if we share them if we send out an email follow-up. I'd be happy to do that.
Great, thank you.
And can I just add?
Sure.
One sort of simple lesson along the lines of something that Tristan mentioned earlier in the webinar would be to take your student's textbook and see what it says about the Moral Act, and then have them go on to landgrabu.org and ask them what they're not being told in the textbook, and what is the story that they're getting from the website or from the HCN story, to see how the Moral Act, because the Moral Act is not unknown. It has a long tradition of being celebrated for democratizing higher education in the United States, and oftentimes it's sort of it sits in the background of a lot of American sort of consciousness. I had a student here recently tell me, after this story came out, who had been at the University of Wisconsin, saying now she realized why there was a statue of Lincoln on campus, and it just sort of been there, right? And people ruffle his hair when they graduate or something like that, but it's sort of part of the mythology of this sort of the democratization of education. So there is a story that's sort of well established, and sort of a myth that Americans tell themselves about themselves, and you can use the website to challenge and reframe that thinking.
Absolutely.
I'd just like to add, I think it was it was really, it's great to hear from K-12 educators being interested in this, because as Tristan said, this is stuff that was missed for a lot of people the first time they went through American history education. And this is a chance to change that. And it's not, it really is society-wide. The New York Times published an op-ed talking about, or an editorial talking about the America we need, and a whole, list of prescriptions of how we could become a better country after COVID-19. And one of the things they pointed to was the success of the Morrill Act, and we need more things like that. And so Bobby and Tristan jumped on that and wrote a rebuttal to that, which the New York Times, to their credit, published, and which I put a link to in the chat.
Okay, this is another question related to the data, and are there parallels to teachers' colleges in the U.S.? Did you see or find any teachers' colleges in your research?
There are. It's not in this story, but there is another story waiting to be told about these teacher colleges in the 19th century. They were called normal schools. Word normal. And they also received land through. There are thousands of land laws redistributing basically the continent by the what is in the United States today, redistributing it through sales, through auctions, through gifts, military bounty warrants, preemption claims, homesteads, for all manners of individuals, speculators, organizations, institutions, states. Think about the size of the continent, think about sort of the variety of the United States. There's pretty much no place where you can look, where you can trace back some sort of institutional framework that's benefiting from the conversion of indigenous homelands into U.S. real estate. And the teachers, I don't know about all teachers' colleges, but certainly some that were supported by states would have been beneficiaries of in the same way as the Morrill Act colleges.
Fascinating. So educators and journalists, there are thousands of stories just waiting and sitting in plain sight to be further pursued and followed up on. And I want to just say that we have to wrap here, and I want to give our sincere thanks to Tristan, Ahtone, Geoff, McGhee, and Dr. Bobby Lee. We really thank you for this impressive work. It's a terrific body of work that will be a legacy, we think, for the future, people who want to build off this work. So thank you so much. And thank you for our audience for your interest in sticking with us. If you're interested in learning more about this particular project or finding out other interesting underreported stories, please go to our website at pulitzercenter.org, where you can find that. And I want to let everyone know that next week we have another Talks At, and that one will happen on Wednesday, May 27th. And you can join us for a discussion with the New Yorker contributing writer Luke Mogelson, as he considers U.S. foreign policy revolving around Syria. And also remember, after this, if the audience could hang on for a few minutes, we have a brief survey that'll pop up once the session's over. Last thing we'd like to remind you is we are a nonprofit organization. We depend on support from donors. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your support. And we hope to see you next time. Thank you.